The San Juan Mountains do not care who you are. They rise the same way for the wealthy and the broken granite and silence and sky so wide it makes ambition look small. In the valley below, a town of 400 souls goes about its winter, smoke from chimneys, a dog crossing an empty street. The ordinary world doing ordinary things. Higher up, where the road turns to dirt and the trees press close, a cabin sits against the cliff face that has been standing since before memory. The windows are dark. The porch lists at one corner, nothing moves. But beneath the floor, beneath the dust and the decades and the careful silence of a woman who built this place alone, something has been waiting. A locked hatch, a combination no one living has ever entered. And somewhere on the highway below, headlights are climbing. She doesn't know yet what she's driving toward. The mountain does. The San Juan Mountains do not care who you are. They rise the same way for the wealthy and the broken granite and silence and sky so wide it makes ambition look small. In the valley below, a town of 400 souls goes about its winter. Smoke from chimneys, a dog crossing an empty street, the ordinary world doing ordinary things. Higher up, where the road turns to dirt and the trees press close, a cabin sits against a cliff face that has been standing since before memory. The windows are dark, the porch lists at one corner, nothing moves, but beneath the floor, beneath the dust and the decades and the careful silence of a woman who built this place alone, something has been waiting. A locked hatch, a combination no one living has ever entered, and somewhere on the highway below, headlights are climbing. She doesn't know yet what she's driving toward. The mountain does. There was a woman who lived in a Ford Explorer with her 10-year-old daughter for 243 nights in a row, and every single morning she tied her hair back in the parking lot of a Walmart and told herself today would be different. People who saw her assumed she was shopping early. They didn't look long enough to notice that she never came out with bags. But what they didn't know was that on the 244th morning, a phone call would arrive before sunrise, and the woman on the other end of that call would learn that her grandmother had left her a falling down cabin on a Colorado mountainside, $5 in cash, and a secret that had been waiting 150 years for exactly the wrong person to inherit it. Before we continue, if you're the kind of person who believes that the quietest stories sometimes carry the heaviest truths, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, and this channel is where they live. Now, let us begin at the beginning. The beginning was cold. It was always cold in November at 5:15 in the morning in the Walmart parking lot of Highway 285, and Nora Aldridge had long since stopped being surprised by that particular truth. Cold was the first thing she felt each day before thought, before memory, before the slow return of everything she was carrying. It settled into her lower back with the specificity of something that knew her well. 243 mornings of bucket seats had given the cold a precise address. She lay still for a moment with her eyes open, staring at the frost that had crept up the inside of the windshield overnight. It had made fern shapes in the glass. She'd noticed that about the cold, it was an artist given enough time and silence. It made things beautiful when no one was watching. She turned carefully so as not to wake Wren. Her daughter was in the back seat under 3 winter coats and a fleece blanket printed with horses that had been Wren's since she was 4 years old. The blanket was too small now. It never quite reached Wren's feet, and Nora had sewn a strip of fleece to the bottom hem with a needle and thread from the sewing kit she kept in the glove compartment between the registration and the protein bars. Wren didn't know about the addition. She thought the blanket had always been that length, and Nora had decided there were certain illusions worth maintaining. Her daughter's face in sleep looked like a question mark. That was the only way Nora had ever been able to describe it, something about the angle of Wren's jaw, the slight furrow between her brows, even in rest, suggested a mind that never fully stopped working through problems. She'd been born that way. Even as an infant, she'd looked at the world with the polite suspicion of someone who had arrived expecting different arrangements. Nora's phone read 5:17. The gym opened at 5:30. They had 13 minutes to look like they'd just arrived for early cardio, rather than like they'd spent another night in a parking lot in November in a car that needed new tires and a transmission flush and at least 4 other things the mechanic had circled on the last invoice before Nora had quietly folded it into her pocket and said she'd call to schedule. She reached for the wallet in the cup holder and counted without looking at the bills, a skill she'd developed the way you develop any skill through repetition that began in necessity and ended in reflex. $1,847. The math arranged itself the way it always did, fast and merciless. $600 for the storage unit, where everything they owned sat in a 10 by 10 space on Leedsdale Drive, her mother's quilt, Wren's art supplies, the box of photographs from the marriage she'd stopped opening, $420 for the car insurance she couldn't let lapse because without the car there was no sleep, and without sleep there was no teaching, and without teaching there was nothing at all. $250 to the credit card minimum. Phone bill, Wren's school lunch account, the gym membership that was not about fitness. She allowed herself to do the math once, and then she put the wallet back. There was a thing she'd learned about surviving, which was that you could not look at the whole picture all at once. You had to take it in sections. This section was 13 minutes. This section was getting Wren into the gym before the front desk changed shifts, and the new attendant looked up instead of at her phone. She reached back and touched her daughter's shoulder gently, the way you touch something you are afraid to break. Wren's eyes opened immediately. She'd always woken that way, no transition, no slow surfacing. Just closed and then open, present, and accounted for. She sat up and pulled the horse blanket around her shoulders like a cape, and for a moment she was simply a child who had just woken up, nothing more complicated than that. Then she looked at her mother's face and read it, and became something older. She didn't ask how Nora had slept. She started folding the coats. This was their morning routine. The way other families had morning routines, the particular choreography of people who have lived in close quarters long enough that they've stopped needing to announce intentions. Nora started the engine. Wren zipped her backpack and tucked it under the seat. The Ford coughed once and then settled into its low idle, the heater making promises it only sometimes kept. Wren's school uniform was in a gallon Ziploc bag in the trunk, alongside Nora's teaching clothes. They had learned through trial and error, with a wrinkled blouse, on a Tuesday in October, to fold everything flat and seal the bag against the particular humidity of a car in winter. Nora sometimes thought she could write a book about the logistics of dignity, the small engineering of appearing every day like someone to whom nothing unusual was happening. The gym attendant was 19 and deeply committed to a video on her phone involving what appeared to be a bread baking competition. She swiped their cards without looking up. The women's locker room smelled of eucalyptus body wash and the particular warmth of tile that has been heated all night. Nora stood under the shower and gave herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite luxury, but was adjacent to it, just hot water and the sensation of her shoulders dropping from somewhere near her ears to somewhere near her body. 30 seconds, then efficient, then out. Wren emerged from her own shower stall, with her hair dripping and her school uniform on, already pulling her braid tight with a practiced precision. The uniform was 2 years old. Nora had let the hem down twice. She kept it laundered and pressed at the coin laundromat on Federal with the discipline of someone who understood that certain things could not be allowed to slip, because certain things once slipped did not stop. By 7:15 they were in the school drop-off line at Birchfield Elementary. The hug lasted longer than usual. Wren pressed her face against the side of Nora's neck and stayed there, and Nora felt the particular weight of a child who was pretending not to be afraid. Then Wren pulled back, shouldered her bag, and walked through the front doors without looking back, the walk of someone who had decided that looking back didn't help. Nora sat in the drop-off lane until the car behind her tapped its horn. She drove to Henderson Middle School, where she taught Introduction to Visual Art to 6th and 7th graders who were at various stages of caring, from genuinely passionate to aggressively indifferent. She had 3 classes that day. She taught value scales in the first period and contour drawing in the second, and spent the third helping a boy named Tobias figure out why his perspective drawing kept collapsing something about how he'd placed the vanishing point too close to the edge of the paper, giving everything a slightly panicked tilt, like a world about to slide off a table. She understood the feeling. Between second and third period, her phone buzzed in her cardigan pocket. Unknown number, Colorado area code. She almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers at 8:45 in the morning were rarely good news, and she'd learned the same way she'd learned to count money by touch, that bad news didn't improve with postponement. It only accumulated interest. The voice on the other end was a man's professionally modulated in the way of someone who delivered difficult information as a matter of daily practice. Frederick Holt, with Patterson Holt and Associates in Denver. He was calling regarding the estate of Cecily Marie Aldrich. The hallway sounds, lockers, sneakers on linoleum, someone dropping something metal, seemed to come from a very long distance. Her grandmother had passed 4 days ago. The funeral had been held the previous Saturday. Nora stood in the doorway of her classroom and pressed her back against the frame and breathed carefully through the space between one sentence and the next. She had not known. She had not had the gas to drive to Denver from the suburb where she taught, and she had not asked anyone for help getting there, because the last time she'd asked someone in her family for help, her brother Edmund had told her in the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone slow that he couldn't enable poor decisions, and she had not made that mistake again. She had called Cecily instead from a parking lot, and Cecily had said simply, "You are going through what you need to go through," and that had been enough. She had not known her grandmother was ill. She had assumed the particular cruelty of assumption that Cecily would be there when this period ended, the way mountains were there, the way gravity was there, the way certain things simply continued, because the alternative was unthinkable. The will reading was Monday morning at 10. He hoped she could attend. She stood very still until she could speak. She would be there. She drove home that afternoon through traffic that moved like cold honey wren in the passenger seat, doing long division in a notebook balanced on her knees, asking occasional questions about state capitals and whether moths could navigate by streetlights the same way they navigated by the moon, and Nora answered each one and said nothing about the phone call. She told Wren after dinner was peanut butter on bread and apple slices eaten in the car in a different parking lot. She moved them every few nights, a habit she developed to avoid patterns which she understood was its own kind of exhaustion. Wren listened without interrupting her apple slice suspended halfway to her mouth. Then was it Grandma Cecily? Yes. Wren set the apple slice down very carefully on the edge of the cup holder. They sat in the quiet for a moment that had its own particular texture. "I didn't know she was sick." Nora's voice came out rougher than she intended. "I should have driven up more. I should have." She stopped because there were a dozen endings to that sentence, and none of them changed anything. Wren reached across the console and put her hand over Nora's. She was very small, and she did this as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though she were the one with something to offer, and Nora thought not for the first time that there was something in her daughter that had been forged in these 8 months that was both miraculous and wrong. Children should not have to develop this kind of steadiness. They should not have to learn to be rocks for their mothers. And yet, here they were. There's a will reading on Monday. A lawyer called. The hope that moved across Wren's face then was a complicated thing, specific, careful, the hope of a child who has learned to want things in small increments rather than large ones. Not a mansion, just a door that locked, just a room that was hers, just the ordinary miracle of an address. Nora watched it move across her daughter's face and said nothing. She didn't know what Cecily had left her. She knew that Edmund had always been Cecily's favorite in the way that successful people are often favorites, not because they are loved more, but because they are easiest to love, because their lives confirm the things you want to believe are possible. And Harriet had Cecily's intelligence and her way with words, and had parlayed both into a partnership at a downtown law firm that Cecily had mentioned with the quiet pride of someone who had contributed something to the world. And Nora had chosen art. She had chosen teaching. She had chosen a man who turned out to be someone she had known well enough to choose, and then the money ran out, and the house was in his name, and the judge had looked at her salary with something that was not quite pity. She did not know what Cecily would have left her. She held the hope carefully the way you hold something that might break. Monday morning arrived with the kind of blue sky cold that Colorado produces in November, as if to prove something. Nora had cashed her paycheck Friday, 2,140 direct deposit, which had gone to its usual destinations with the precision of a system that had been running long enough to be automatic. Storage, insurance, credit card. What remained had to reach 30 days. She wore her one funeral-appropriate dress, a dark green wrap she'd bought on clearance the winter before everything changed. She'd steamed it in the gym's steam room at 6:15, moving quickly, hoping no one came in, which no one did. Wren wore her school uniform because it was the best thing she owned, and they both knew it without saying so. The law office was on the 8th floor of a building downtown where every surface had been chosen to communicate permanence. Brass, marble, the particular smell of paper and leather that suggested nothing here had ever been uncertain. Edmund was already in the conference room when they arrived, phone to his ear, one hand gesturing at something invisible. He wore what appeared to be a suit that cost more than Nora made in a month. He glanced up when she entered and then returned to his call in the way you return to something after a minor interruption. He had not come to the parking lot. He had not offered the $2,000 she'd asked for. 8 months ago, that would have been a deposit on an apartment, that would have been a door that locked. He had instead explained to her gently and at length that he could not enable patterns of poor decision-making. He had said this from his downtown penthouse. He had said this and then presumably had gone back to his evening, which had contained, as far as Nora could tell, nothing that cost him anything. Harriet arrived at 10 past the scent of something expensive, arriving slightly before she did. Briefcase cashmere coat, the Cartier watch Nora recognized from Cecily's birthday 3 years ago. She looked at Nora and Wren with the rapid assessment of someone who moved through rooms quickly and processed information on the way, and whatever she calculated, she said nothing about it, just opened her leather notepad and clicked her pen and sat. Frederick Holt arranged his papers with the care of a man who understood that what he was about to read would land differently in different bodies, and that his job was to read it clearly and then step back. He read the small bequests first. 15,000 to the Denver Art Initiative, 5,000 to the public library in a town called Copperfield up in the San Juans, 10,000 split between the food bank and the women's shelter. Edmund's pen tapped once against the table. To my grandson, Edmund Reeve Aldridge, I leave the property located at 2847 Cherry Hills Drive, including all structures and contents. Edmund nodded once, set his pen down. He had known the way certain people always know what they're owed. To my granddaughter Harriet Louise Forsyth, I leave my complete collection of antique silver pieces appraised at $900,000 and my estate jewelry appraised at $160,000. Harriet made a note. Efficient, transactional, like tallying a quarterly report. Holt paused. His eyes found Nora's, with something she would later identify as apology. To my granddaughter, Nora Catherine Aldridge, I leave the sum of $5 in cash. He held a pause for exactly 1 second, and the original mountain homestead located at Copper Peak, San Juan Mountains, Colorado. Property deed, GPS coordinates and keys to the structure to be provided separately. The silence that followed had weight and direction. It pressed inward. Edmund laughed. It wasn't a polite sound. It started in his chest and opened into the room, genuine and unhurried, the laugh of a man who found something actually funny. He shook his head, and the laugh tapered into something that still wore a smile at the edges. He looked at Nora the way you look at a punchline after it lands. Harriet's expression didn't break into laughter. It did something more considered a slight compression of the lips, a lift at the corner. The look of someone watching a prediction confirmed. She turned her pen between her fingers once. Perhaps proportional, she said to the life contributions in question. You built a company, she said to Edmond without looking at him. I made partner. Nora draws pictures with middle schoolers for $38,000 a year. She said it the way you say something you believe to be simply factual, no particular heat, which was worse than heat. Nora did not move. 8 months of sleeping in a car had given her a very particular skill, which was the ability to absorb impact without showing where it landed. She kept her hand still on the table. She kept her face where she'd put it. Beside her, Wren's hand found hers under the edge of the table, small fingers pressing in. Holt cleared his throat with the deliberateness of a man exercising the only professional authority available to him. He said that Mrs. Aldridge had left specific instructions that Nora visit the property in person before making any decisions regarding its disposition. He said that the 40 acres were fully owned, no liens, no encumbrances, property taxes aren't through year's end. He said the word 40 acres and watched it cross the table and reach Edmund, who processed it and then shrugged in the way of someone who had done the math and found it irrelevant. 40 acres of mountain rock and a condemned shack, Edmund said. He wasn't laughing now, just settling back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man for whom this was already finished. When you're ready to unload it, call me. I'll get you enough to cover the hassle. Harriet gathered her papers with the economical movements of someone for whom time was a measurable resource. She paused at the door. "When you decide to be practical about this," she said without turning back, "we can connect you with someone who handles rural land sales." The door closed. Holt waited until the sound of them had passed entirely down the hall. Then he pushed a thick manila envelope across the table. Inside, he said, she would find the deed, the GPS coordinates, the keys, and a personal letter from her grandmother. He stood and began collecting his papers, and then he paused in the way of someone who has something more to say and is deciding whether saying it falls within his professional purview. "Your grandmother spoke of you often," he said. "She was quite specific in her instructions and quite clear about her reasons, even if she chose not to write all of them into the will itself. She said, and he seemed to be repeating something he'd committed to memory, that Nora will understand when the time is right. He gave Nora the room for as long as she needed it. She sat there for a while after he left, holding the envelope in both hands, looking at the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city arranged below them and the sky beyond the city, blue and cold and entirely indifferent. Then she opened the envelope. The first thing she touched was metal, heavy, circular, warm, despite the room's temperature, as though it had been sitting in a patch of sunlight. She lifted it out and found a pocket watch, gold, the case worn smooth at the edges by what must have been decades of hands. She turned it over and found the inscription on the back, engraved in script that someone had taken care with each letter given its proper weight. "Time reveals all truths, 1871. She pressed the crown and the case opened. The watch face was ivory and clean, the hands pointing accurately to 10:43. She held it near her ear the way you'd hold something delicate, and heard it, the steady, unhurried tick of a mechanism that had no interest in rushing. She had not expected that. She had expected silence, or at minimum the dry complaint of a spring gone stiff, but the watch was running. Had been running apparently without interruption or apology. She set it on the table and opened the letter. Cecily's handwriting was the kind that belonged to a generation that had been taught penmanship as a form of character, each letter formed with intention, the lines between words, even and considered. 3 pages. Nora spread them flat. "They laughed, didn't they?" The letter began. "I knew they would. That's why I'm trusting you and not them." Nora pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth and kept reading. "The mountain property isn't what it seems. Your great-great-great-grandmother Agnes Whitmore, born 1849, built that homestead in 1871, was a woman history didn't know what to do with. Her mother was English, her father Ute, and she was rejected by both worlds as a consequence, but she survived. She made a home in a place no one else wanted, and she discovered something there that she spent the rest of her life protecting, not because she was afraid of it, but because she'd made a promise, and she was the kind of woman who understood that a promise is not a convenience. I've been protecting it for 50 years, Cecily wrote, waiting for the right person to carry it forward. Not the richest person, not the most successful, the right person. You've been through what you've been through, Nora. Homeless, divorced, broke in the particular way that strips everything away and shows you what's underneath. And what I've watched in you from a distance because you wouldn't let me too close, which is your stubbornness and also your strength, is that you kept protecting Ren's joy. You kept teaching beauty to children who didn't know they needed it. You kept your word even when keeping it cost you everything. That's rare. That's what I needed. Go to the cabin, northeast corner alcove floor. Look for the loose board. Below it, a hatch. The combination is 1871. The year Agnes built her home. What's below will change things for you. But Nora, listen to me. How you use what you find will define everything that comes after. This isn't simply money. It's a covenant Agnes made that I've kept and am now passing to you. At the bottom of the second page, a single line, go first to Ridgeway. Find Eleanor Marsh. Blue house on Maple Street. She knows what I couldn't finish saying. And then at the bottom of the third page, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, written perhaps at a different sitting, or later, or when the fatigue of illness had begun to make its presence known a postscript. I paid the property taxes for 50 years without telling anyone. Edmund doesn't know the taxes are current. He doesn't know I've had the land assessed. He doesn't know about Eleanor or what Eleanor found or the agreement I reached with the tribal council 7 years ago. He thinks it's a ruin. It isn't. He's been told what I wanted him to know. You've been given what I wanted you to have. Don't let anyone convince you those are the same thing. Nora read the letter twice. She read it a third time. Slowly, the pocket watch on the table beside her still ticking with its patient and unhurried measure. Then she gathered everything back into the envelope, stood, picked up the watch and slipped it into the pocket of her funeral dress. It settled against her hip with an easy weight, as though it had been there before. Wren had been sitting very still through all of it, her hands in her lap, her eyes on her mother's face, with that particular attention that Nora had stopped trying to deflect. "Mom," her voice was careful. "Is it good or bad?" Nora thought about the question. "I don't know yet," she said, "but it's something. It's something Grandma Cecily kept for 50 years, and she chose to give it to us. That's not nothing." Wren looked at the envelope, at the slight rectangular shape of the pocket watch in her mother's dress pocket. "What's that, a watch? Agnes's, I think. Cecily's, too. Now ours. Is it running?" "It is." Wren considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to questions of consequence. "Then they should go," she said. "They should go." They left the building through the lobby and walked through the November cold to the parking garage where the Ford sat on the second level. Nora started the engine. The check engine light came on, as it always did, orange and patient. She pulled out of the garage and into the afternoon traffic and pointed them toward the highway south. She drove without the radio. The watch ticked in her pocket. She had somewhere to be. She didn't know yet what she was driving toward. She knew only that her grandmother had spent 50 years making sure the right person was in the right place, and that someone named Eleanor Marsh lived in a blue house on Maple Street in a town called Ridgeway, and that a hatch under a cabin floor had been waiting since 1871 for a combination that had been sitting all along in the year of its making. She knew that Edmund had laughed, and that Harriet had said what she'd said, and that the room had been designed to make her feel small, and had partially succeeded. She knew that the watch in her pocket had not stopped, not once, not for how long she couldn't say, but it kept its rhythm regardless. It didn't rush, it didn't slow, it simply continued marking time with the steady conviction of something that had decided at some point long before her that this was what it was for. Maybe that was enough for now. Maybe that was enough to drive toward. The highway opened up past the city's edge, and the mountains appeared on the horizon, white-topped and enormous and entirely real, and Wren fell asleep against the window with her cheek on her balled-up cardigan, and Nora drove into the late afternoon light with 50 years of someone else's faithfulness riding in her pocket, ticking. Ridgeway appeared the way small mountain towns appear when you've been driving long enough that you've stopped expecting anything suddenly, without announcement, tucked into a valley between peaks that had no interest in making things easy for the people who chose to live among them. The population sign read 412. Nora pulled the Ford to the shoulder and looked at it for a moment. 412 people who had decided that this particular fold in the mountains was where their lives belonged. She thought about what it meant to choose a place that hard to reach and harder to leave, and then she thought about Agnes Whitmore building a cabin against a granite cliff face in 1871 with no one to help her, and she pulled back onto the road. Ruth's General Store occupied the end of the main street in a two-story building that had the look of something assembled over decades rather than designed. A hand-lettered sign in the window advertised fishing licenses and propane refills, and something called the Tuesday Soup, no further explanation offered. 3 pickup trucks sat outside, all of them carrying the particular dignity of trucks that had earned their dens. The bell over the door chimed once when Nora pushed it open. The smell was coffee and sawdust and something baking in the back that she couldn't name, but that made her suddenly acutely aware that she'd eaten half a protein bar at noon and nothing since. Ruth Greer looked up from a crossword puzzle behind the counter and did what Nora would come to understand was Ruth's essential gesture, a single unhurried assessment, the kind of look that didn't ask you to explain yourself, but made clear it would wait until you were ready. She was 70 or near it. White hair pulled back without ceremony, hands that had the look of decades of practical use. "I need supplies," Nora said. "Flashlights, rope if you have it, camping gear." Ruth came around the counter without hurry and began moving toward the back shelves. "Getting up to Copper Peak," she said. "It wasn't a question." Nora stopped. "How did you know only property up that road worth supplying for?" She lifted a flashlight from the shelf, tested it against her palm, set it back, took the next one. "Your name, Aldridge?" "Yes." Ruth set two heavy flashlights on the counter and turned to face her with the directness of someone who had decided something. Cecily came through here every autumn for 20 years, bought miners' lanterns and topographic paper and canned goods that could last a winter. She paused. I was sorry to hear she passed. She said it simply without the particular performance of condolence that Nora had been bracing for since the lawyer's office. Did she ever say what she was doing up there? Ruth considered this with the care of someone who distinguished between what she knew and what was hers to share. Never asked. Figured the mountain was her business. But I'll tell you what I noticed, which is that she always bought the same things in the same quantities year after year. Like she was maintaining something, not discovering, maintaining. She began moving through the store again, gathering items with the efficiency of long-practice batteries, waterproof matches, a first aid kit that had the solid weight of something military surplus. Then she stopped at the end of an aisle and turned back, and this time the assessment in her eyes had shifted toward something that might have been decision. There's a woman in town, lives on Maple Blue House, can't miss it. Eleanor Marsh, geologist retired. Your grandmother used to bring her rock samples sometimes when she came down from the mountain. I don't know what they talked about, but I know that Eleanor is the kind of person who keeps what she's told to keep and says what she means when she says it. She set a hand on the shelf. If I were going up to that cabin for the first time, she said, I'd want Eleanor to know I was going. Nora looked at her. Cecily's letter had said the same thing. Two people, two different sources, the same blue house on Maple. She paid for the supplies in cash, $94, which she counted out from the remaining bills in her wallet with the practiced lack of reaction she developed for exactly these moments. Ruth bagged everything carefully and then, without comment, added a paper bag from behind the counter. There's soup in there, she said. Tuesday soup. You and your girl. Nora opened her mouth. Don't, Ruth said, not unkindly. Just go find Eleanor. The blue house on Maple was exactly what Ruth had said. Unmissable, a particular shade of blue that someone had chosen with conviction. The garden in front looked less like a garden and more like an argument for geological timestones arranged on low walls with small handwritten labels pressed into the soil beside each one. Even the stepping stones had been chosen for their content. Nora could see the faint impression of a shell fossil in the one nearest the porch. She knocked. Wren stood beside her with the bag of soup held in both hands, reading the labels on the stones with open curiosity. The woman who opened the door was tall and slightly stooped and wore reading glasses pushed up into a chaos of white hair. She took one look at Nora and said simply, You have her eyes. Come in. Eleanor Marsh's house was a working space in the way that only a life's work could make a space. Shelves from floor to ceiling on every wall, labeled specimens in rows, geological maps layered on every flat surface. It smelled of mineral samples and old paper, and the particular concentration of someone who had spent decades paying attention to things most people walked past. She cleared 2 chairs of folders and gestured for them to sit. Then she went to a filing cabinet in the corner, opened the second drawer, and withdrew a manila folder labeled in neat capital letters, Aldridge Confidential. She set it on the desk between them, but did not open it. Instead, she sat down, folded her hands, and looked at Nora with the frank appraisal of someone deciding how much time they had. Your grandmother came to me 12 years ago. She brought rock samples in a canvas bag and asked me to analyze them without telling anyone what I found. I was 61. I'd spent 40 years studying Colorado mineral deposits. I'd seen wire silver maybe 3 times in my career in field conditions. What she put on my desk that afternoon was the finest specimen I'd ever held outside a museum case. Nora waited. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside were photographs, close-ups of rock samples, the stone threaded through with veins that caught the overhead light and threw it back in angles that seemed almost intentional, like the mountain had been trying to say something for a long time and had finally been given the chance. Wire silver, Eleanor said. Exceptional purity, exceptional formation. I told Cecily that the samples alone, just what she'd brought me in that bag, would conservatively appraise at $4 to $6 million. She looked up from the photographs. If there's a vein, an actual producing vein of this consistency and depth, you're looking at 18 to 25 million, possibly more. The room did something strange, which was that it stayed entirely the same while everything inside it rearranged. Wren made a small sound beside Nora, half breath, half something else. Nora put her arm around her daughter and tried to locate her own breathing, which had apparently left on a brief errand. Why didn't she mine it? Nora's voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. Eleanor's expression shifted. She said it wasn't about the money. She said there were people with a prior claim, not a legal claim, not in the modern sense, but a claim that mattered to her. She mentioned indigenous heritage, a sacred site, a promise that had been made before she was born. She set her hands flat on the folder. She was negotiating an agreement with the tribal council. Had been for 7 years, she said when the time was right, she'd pass everything to someone in her family who would see it through. She paused. Nora understood then that Eleanor was watching her the way Ruth had watched her, assessing not what she knew, but what she was. I need to tell you something Eleanor said that I didn't tell Cecily. Something I found in my last survey of the property 3 years ago. She reached into the folder and withdrew a single sheet, a photograph of tire tracks pressed deep into the soft shoulder of the dirt road leading to the cabin, and beside them a blurry image of survey equipment partially obscured by brush. Someone else has been up there, she said. Someone who brought equipment and didn't want to be seen. I did some checking. The survey company is registered to a holding company in Denver. The holding company's registered agent is a man named Edmund Reeve Aldridge. The cold that moved through Nora then was different from the cold of parking lots and frosted windshields. It was the specific cold of understanding arriving all at once. Edmund knew. He had known the land value had gone up, there, had had it quietly assessed, had waited, and then he had stood in a law office and laughed, had said 40 acres of mountain rock, had said congratulations, little sister, you're a slum lord, had performed the contempt so completely that she'd believed it entirely, which was, of course, the point. He'd wanted her to walk away. He'd been counting on her walking away. Nora sat with this for a long moment. Wren was very still beside her, following the adults' faces with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered. Eleanor waited, which Nora was beginning to understand was one of Eleanor's primary skills. "There's more," Nora said. Finally, she told her about the letter, about the hatch, and the combination about Agnes Whitmore, and the promise made in 1871. She told her about the torn photograph and the inscription on the watch, and the word covenant written in Cecily's careful hand. When she finished, Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and began moving through the room with the efficient energy of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a while and was glad it had finally arrived. "I'm 73 years old," she said, pulling equipment from shelves and setting it on the desk with the practiced ease of someone who'd packed for field work hundreds of times. "I have more money than I need and a bad knee and approximately 0 patience left for things that don't matter." She looked up. "I want to see a genuine find one more time before I die." She said it plainly, without drama. "Is that an acceptable arrangement?" Nora looked at this woman, her grandmother's ally, her grandmother's keeper of confidences, 73 years old and already reaching for her field boots, and felt something loosen slightly in the knot she'd been carrying in her chest for 8 months. "Yes," she said, "that's acceptable." The road to the cabin was worse than the GPS had suggested, and better than Nora had feared, which was a reasonable summary of most things. Eleanor's truck took it with the confidence of a vehicle that had been down worse. Nora followed in the Ford, one hand on the wheel, one eye on the check engine light, which glowed with its habitual calm. The clearing appeared at the end of 15 minutes of climbing, and the cabin sat where it had always sat, against the granite cliff face, smaller than imagination, grayer than photographs. A structure that had been arguing with weather for 150 years, and was beginning to lose the argument in 1 or 2 corners of the roof. They worked methodically. Eleanor examined the exterior, first walking the perimeter, with the focused attention of someone who read structures the way other people read books. She pressed her palm against the foundation logs, tested the porch boards with deliberate weight before committing to them, tilted her head at the roof's sagging corner, and made a note in a small book she kept in her breast pocket. The interior 20 feet square, the smell of time and disuse dust that had been accumulating since before Nora was born. She had been here once before in her mind, reading Cecily's letter in the law office, but being here in her body was different. The scale was different. The silence had a different texture. They found the loose board in the alcove the way the letter said they would, Nora pressing her foot to each plank until one shifted, then working her fingers into the gap and lifting. Beneath it, the hatch 3 rotating dials, the iron ring handle set into wood that had been cut and fitted with a precision that suggested someone who understood the difference between work done quickly and work done right. 1871. The tumblers moved with the smooth certainty of a mechanism that had been waiting for the correct sequence for a very long time, and the lock released with a sound that was smaller than it should have been given everything. Nora lifted the hatch. The air that rose from below was cold and mineral, and carried within it something she would not have been able to name, but that felt strangely like depth, like the mountain exhaling. She clipped a flashlight to her belt and looked at Wren. "We go together," Wren said before Nora could speak. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who had thought this through and was not negotiating. They descended together, Nora first, and then Wren, testing each rung before trusting it, counting without speaking. 31 rungs. At the bottom, cold stone under their feet, and the beam of 2 flashlights cutting into a tunnel that stretched beyond the reach of either light. Eleanor called down from above, "Tell me what you see." "A tunnel," Nora called back. "Hand-carved. Timber supports every few feet. Old. Very old." Eleanor's voice carried the particular satisfaction of a scientist whose hypothesis has just been confirmed. "Follow it. Look at the walls." They moved forward. Wren pressed close against Nora's side, but not in fear, in the attentive way of someone who is trying not to miss anything. The tunnel narrowed slightly after the first 50 feet, then opened into a chamber where the mining work became legible in the wall's peak marks in careful horizontal bands. Systematic extraction, the work of someone who understood what they were doing and had been doing it long enough to develop method. Against one wall, wooden crates stacked 3 high. Nora pried the lid from the nearest one. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, chunks of rock shot through with veins that the flashlight caught and threw back in sparks of silver light. She lifted one piece and held it in both hands and felt its weight and looked at the veins threading through the dark stone like something the mountain had written there. Even she could see that these were not ordinary. The second crate held tools handmade, worn with the evidence of extensive use, a pickaxe with initials carved into the handle that Nora had to angle the flashlight carefully to read. A.W. Agnes Whitmore. The third crate was smaller and more carefully constructed, each joint fitted with the extra care of something that mattered. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of waxed cloth, was a leather-bound journal. Nora lifted it with hands she made steady through an act of will. She opened to the first page and read by flashlight. Journal of Agnes Whitmore, March 1871. The entries were written in a hand that combined precision with something that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it, the prose of a woman who had learned to be economical with words because no one had ever encouraged her to take up space. Agnes wrote about the land purchase, $1.25 per acre, paid in gold, she'd saved for 3 years. The claims office had made the transaction difficult. She documented this without apparent anger, simply as fact, the way you document weather. She wrote about building the cabin she'd felled 4 trees herself before a youthman named Running Elk had appeared at the edge of the clearing and watched her work for half a morning without speaking, and then had simply picked up an axe and begun helping. She had not known what to make of this. She wrote about it the way she wrote about everything observationally, without conclusion, leaving room for meaning to arrive later. Then, in May of 1871, the entry that changed the register of everything that had come before it found the vein today, wire silver. The assayer in Silverton said it was the finest formation he'd seen in Colorado. He offered to buy my claim for $300. I told him the claim wasn't for sale. He told me I was foolish. I told him he was welcome to that opinion. A woman alone with a silver vein in 1871 did not tell people she had a silver vein. Agnes was clear-eyed about this in a way that felt reading it a century and a half later, less like fear and more like pragmatism. She had seen what happened to claims held by people who were not the right kind of people. She had felt correctly, paid correctly, built correctly, and none of it had made her the right kind of person. So she was quiet, and she mined carefully in small quantities, taking out only what she needed and concealing the rest. And then in August, Running Elk came back. He brought 2 elders with him. He did not apologize for coming. He showed her the northern end of the tunnel system passages that had been there before, her mining before the cabin, before European settlement chambers, where his people had conducted ceremonies, where young men had come to cross thresholds, where offerings had been left and remained. He showed her all of this with the straightforward clarity of someone who was telling her something important and trusted her to receive it. She had expected anger. He had offered her a covenant. Agnes wrote the details across 2 pages in the journal, and Nora read them standing in the tunnel with the flashlight and Wren's breath fogging in the cold air beside her, and felt 5 generations of consequence arranging themselves in her chest. Running Elk had said, "I know what you found. The mountain gives what the mountain gives. But there are things here that are not yours to take. Protect them, and when your blood comes after you pass that protection forward. This is the agreement. This is what I'm offering in exchange for what you've already taken." And Agnes had written, "I gave my word. It is the least I owe." At the back of the journal, tucked into a pocket sewn into the binding, Nora found something that had not been there when Agnes sealed it. A second piece of paper, different weight, different age, folded twice. She opened it. Cecily's handwriting, dated 2019. "I have contacted the Tribal Council. Joseph Running Water Cultural Preservation Director, Ute Mountain, Ute Tribe. He knows about the chamber. He knows about Agnes's covenant. The tribe has been waiting, not impatiently, but waiting. They've been patient because they understood that the right person in our family hadn't come along yet. I thought it was me. I was wrong. Nora, if you're reading this, which you are, Because I put this here for you specifically. This is what I couldn't finish arranging before the end. Joseph is waiting for your call. He won't push. He's been patient this long. But don't make him wait much longer. The agreement is already written. I just need your signature. Below that, a phone number. Nora folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket beside the watch. They climbed back up into the late afternoon light, and Eleanor was there waiting with her equipment and her notebook, and Nora handed her 3 ore samples from the crate and the journal and said, "Start with these." And Eleanor opened the journal with the focused reverence of someone who had been waiting her whole professional life for exactly this. They worked through the remaining daylight, Eleanor making notes and measurements with the efficiency of someone who didn't trust herself to slow down. Now Nora, photographing every page of the journal on her phone, ran, making her own careful drawings of the tunnel entrance and the cabin exterior in the small sketchbook she kept in her backpack, as if she understood, without being told, that documentation was its own kind of keeping faith. After 20 minutes with the ore samples, Eleanor looked up. "Nora," she said, "what I'm looking at is consistent with everything your grandmother's samples suggested. If the vein continues at this formation and the map in this journal suggests it extends significantly further than what Agnes accessed, you're not looking at 20 million. She paused. You're looking at 30, possibly more. The number sat between them in the cabin's dim light and didn't feel real, and also felt entirely real, which was the particular quality of numbers that were too large for the life you'd been living. "I need to call Joseph Running Water," Nora said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "And you need to call Sam Briggs. He handles mineral rights cases out of Ridgeway. He's good. He'll work with what you have." Nora started to say she didn't have money for a lawyer, and Eleanor held up one hand. "Let me call Sam." Outside, the temperature was dropping with the purposeful efficiency of mountain evenings. Nora stood on the cabin porch while Eleanor made calls inside and looked at the granite cliff face behind the cabin, gray and enormous, and entirely indifferent to what happened at its feet. Wren sat on the porch step beside her sketchbook, in her lap, drawing the tree line. The watch was in Nora's hand. She'd taken it out without deciding, to the way you reach for things that have become familiar. She held it in her palm and felt it stick against her skin, steady, unhurried, marking time, the way it had always marked time through whatever weather preceded this particular moment. Edmund's text arrived at 7:42. She felt the phone buzz in her pocket and looked at the screen in the failing light. Suit filed. Monday 9 a.m. property seizure motion included pending outcome. Enjoy the mountain air. She read it twice. Property seizure, not just contesting the will, seizing the property while the case was active, which would mean restricted access, which would mean everything under this cabin would become unavailable to her before she could act. She heard a second vehicle on the road, then not Eleanor's truck, which was already parked in the clearing. Something else, the sound of a car being driven faster than the road warranted. Edmund's Tesla, appeared through the trees, white in the dusk, followed closely by Harriet's Maserati, which had no business being on a dirt mountain road. But was there any way doing what Harriet did, which was go wherever the situation was? Edmund got out with a man Nora didn't know, carrying camera equipment and a clipboard. Property assessor Edmund said, not greeting her. He's documenting conditions for the seizure motion. He said it the way he said most things, as information he was sharing with her as a courtesy, since the outcome wasn't actually subject to her input. You don't have permission to be here. Nora's voice was level. Edmund looked at her the way he'd been looking at her their whole lives, with the particular patience of someone who expected to win. The will is in contest, he said. During the 90-day probate period, we have standing to document property conditions. He gestured to the assessor, who raised his camera. Eleanor appeared in the cabin doorway. She stepped onto the porch with the unhurried authority of a woman who had been doing field work in difficult conditions for 40 years and was not impressed by the new arrivals. "I don't believe we've met," she said. She extended her hand to Edmund with enough deliberate firmness that he had to take it. "Dr. Eleanor Marsh, retired geologist. I've been consulting on the property at the owner's request." She let that land, which she has every right to do. Harriet's eyes moved from Eleanor to Nora, to the cabin entrance, and back to Eleanor. "Consulting on what basis? Scientific analysis of geological formations. Entirely legal." Harriet's expression did not change, but something behind it recalculated. She looked at the ore samples Nora had carried up and left on the porch railing, and she looked at them for 1 second too long, which told Nora that Harriet knew enough to know what she was looking at. Then Edmund said the thing he'd come to say. $100,000, he said. Cash. Sign the property over now tonight, and I'll drop the seizure motion and the custody review both. He let the last word settle. David's concerned about Wren's living situation. He's prepared to file for an emergency modification. You can't afford that fight, Maya, he caught himself. Nora, you can't afford any of this. Take the money. Custody review. Wren was on the porch step. She had her sketchbook closed in her lap, and she was looking at her uncle with an expression that Nora would carry for a long time, not fear, but something older than fear, the look of a child who has understood that adults will use whatever is available. Nora looked at Edmund. She thought about the parking lot. She thought about the gym attendant who never looked up. She thought about the horse blanket with the strip of fleece she'd sewn to the bottom because some illusions were worth maintaining. She thought about Wren folding coats in the dark without being asked. She looked at her brother, and she felt many things, and she let none of them onto her face. "Get off my land," she said. "You have until I count to 10. Edmund's smile stayed in place. "There's no cell service up here," he said. Eleanor had her phone raised. "There's a satellite communicator in my truck," she said pleasantly. "I get through to anyone I need." She looked at Edmund without blinking. "I'd suggest you go." The assessor was already backing toward the Tesla, reading the room more accurately than Edmund was choosing to. Edmund held Nora's gaze for a long moment, looking for the crack, the break, the place where she would fold, and didn't find it, and that surprised him, which was something. "Monday," he said. 9 a.m. Hope you have arrangements. They left in a convoy of expensive cars that kicked up dust, visible long after the sounds faded. Eleanor was already on her satellite communicator, calling Sam Briggs, her voice crisp and exact. Nora stood on the porch until the dust settled, and then she sat on the step where Wren was and put her arm around her daughter, and the two of them sat there in the mountain dark, the watch ticking in Nora's pocket, the stars beginning to show themselves in the spaces between the clouds. "What's going to happen?" Wren's voice was quiet. Nora looked at the sky. "We're going to go into that tunnel tomorrow," she said. "We're going to find what Agnes protected, and we're going to make sure the people it belongs to know it's there. And then we're going to go to court on Monday, and we're going to tell the truth." And if that's not enough, Nora held her daughter close against the cold. "Then it'll have to be," she said. "But I don't think it won't be." From somewhere in the dark below the cabin, through 30 feet of granite and timber, and the careful architecture of a woman who had built to last, came a sound. Faint, irregular, the settling of old wood in night cold, or the drip of underground water finding a new path, or the quiet protest of something that had been very still for a very long time and was beginning slowly to move. Wren heard it too. She pressed closer. The watch kept its time. The northern tunnel was colder than the main chamber. It narrowed as they went, the ceiling dropping by inches, until Eleanor moved in a careful stoop, her headlamp throwing shadows that shifted with every step. Nora went first, then Wren, then Eleanor, behind them both. Her breathing steady and deliberate, the breathing of someone who had spent a career in spaces that required patience. The sound of the underground stream grew louder as they moved north, not a rush, but a persistent trickle, water finding its way through stone the way it always eventually found its way through stone, by simply continuing. 200 feet in the passage opened. The cavern was not large, but it was large enough that their lights couldn't find all of it at once. Limestone formations hung from the ceiling, built over millennia, in shapes that suggested time operating at a scale that made human urgency seem beside the point. The floor was uneven water, pooling in low places, each pool holding a perfect reflection of the lights they carried. In one corner, the sound of the stream was loudest water, entering from a crack in the wall and vanishing into the stone floor, going somewhere deeper than any of them could follow. Against the far wall, a barrier of stacked stones, not natural, not collapsed, stacked with deliberate care, each stone chosen for fit the joints between them tight enough that they had held for 150 years without settling into disorder. Agnes's work, the work of a woman who understood that a thing worth protecting was worth protecting well. They removed the stones one at a time, setting each aside with the attention you give to something that belongs to someone else. It took 40 minutes. Eleanor documented each layer with photographs, her movements precise and unhurried. Wren handed stones to Nora, who stacked them carefully to the side. No one spoke much. The work had its own language. When the barrier was down, the chamber behind it was perhaps 6 feet deep, naturally formed, protected on 3 sides by solid granite. Agnes had chosen the site carefully. The overhang above it kept moisture from entering directly, and the tight stone seal had done the rest. The temperature inside was cold, and even the same cold that preserved things. Wooden crates, woven baskets sealed with dried clay, each one placed with intention, a few inches of space between them, as if Agnes had understood that crowding was its own form of carelessness. Nora reached for the nearest basket with hands that had learned somewhere in the last 8 months to be careful with fragile things. The woven material held at her touch. She lifted the lid. Inside pottery fragments, each piece painted with geometric patterns in black on red clay, the lines precise and deliberate shapes that told stories in a language Nora couldn't read but recognized as language. She photographed each piece before touching it, and when she touched it, she held it the way you hold a letter written by someone you've never met but already owe something to. "These are old," Eleanor said from behind her. She was looking over Nora's shoulder with a stillness that was different from her scientific attention, quieter, more considered. Ceremonial pottery. Youth. 200 years, possibly older. She paused. "This is not a mine," she said. "This is a library." They worked through the crates slowly, ceremonial objects wrapped in leather that had held its integrity against the cold and dry, beaded items whose patterns were intricate enough that Nora found herself slowing involuntarily to look. Tools of bone and stone, each one made with the care of something intended to last, to be used, to be passed forward. Wren had stopped beside a small wooden box that sat apart from the others, as if Agnes had understood it needed its own space. She looked at her mother before touching it. Nora nodded. Wren lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in cloth so old it had the texture of ash, were 3 pages torn from Agnes's journal. Not the journal they'd already found, but an earlier one, the spine long gone, the pages loose. The handwriting was the same, but the ink had faded toward the color of the stone around them. Nora held them to the light of her headlamp and read aloud, her voice low and even in the cavern's quiet. "August 1871. Running elk brought me here today. I had my pickaxe with me. I left it at the entrance without being asked. Some tools don't belong in every place." He showed me what his people had kept here. Objects from ceremonies I have no words for. Places where young men crossed from one version of themselves into another. Offerings made to something larger than any one person's understanding of the world. I stood there with my hands at my sides and felt the specific shame of someone who has taken without asking, not the silver that was in the earth, and the earth gives what it gives. But I had taken space. I had taken assumption. I had walked in as though the mountain belonged to whoever arrived with a deed. Running Elk did not condemn this. He made me an offer instead. "Protect what is here," he said, When you profit from the silver, give something back. Not payment, that's a different transaction. A covenant. Different from a contract, because a contract ends when the terms are met. A covenant passes forward. I gave my word. I am not certain I am equal to it, but I intend to find out. Nora lowered the pages. The cavern was very quiet, except for the underground stream, which continued its work without any interest in what the humans around it were deciding. "Mom?" Wren's voice was barely above a whisper. "Look!" At the bottom of the wooden box, beneath where the journal pages had rested, was a folded piece of paper, different from the aged pages, newer the fold crisp. Nora lifted it out and opened it and recognized the handwriting immediately. Cecily, dated 3 years ago. Joseph Running Water knows this chamber exists. He knows about the covenant. I showed him Agnes's journal in 2017, and we spent 6 months negotiating an agreement that honors both the silver claim and the tribal heritage protections. The agreement is signed on my end. It's been waiting for yours. I have one more thing to tell you that I couldn't write in the letter I left with Frederick, because Frederick is a good lawyer, but this isn't a legal matter. Edmund came to me 2 years ago. He'd had the property assessed privately without telling me. He made an offer to buy the mountain property from my estate before I died, which is not how estates work, and I told him so. He said he was trying to simplify things for the family. I told him I appreciated his concern. I knew then that he understood the land's value. I revised my will the following week. I am not telling you this, so you'll be angry at your brother. Anger is expensive, and you have enough expenses. I'm telling you because you need to understand that what is coming at you on Monday morning is not a surprise. It was planned, and so was this. The agreement with Joseph is in a safe deposit box at First Mountain Bank in Ridgeway, box 441. The key is taped to the inside back cover of Agnes's journal. Everything is ready. It has been ready for 3 years. I was just waiting for you. Nora stood in the cavern for a long moment, with the letter in her hands and the underground stream moving somewhere beneath her feet, going where it was going with total certainty, and she thought about her grandmother driving up to this mountain every autumn for 50 years, buying lanterns and topographic paper, talking to Eleanor, talking to Joseph, building year by year the architecture of something that was meant to outlast her. She thought about what it cost to carry a secret carefully for 50 years and trust that the right person would eventually be standing in the right place to receive it. She thought about the gym attendant who never looked up. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket alongside the watch, and the two things rested there together, the ticking and the paper, and she turned to Eleanor and said, "There's a key in Agnes's journal and a safe deposit box in town. We need to get to Ridgeway before the bank closes." They made it with 11 minutes to spare. Box 441 held a folder 3 inches thick. The agreement between Cecily Marie Aldridge and the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council witnessed and notarized 18 pages detailing the return of sacred sites and ceremonial objects to tribal custody, the preservation of mineral rights with Nora as heir, and a 10% contribution from any future mining proceeds to the tribe's cultural preservation fund. Beside it, a handwritten note from Joseph Running Water to Cecily, dated 2020. We are ready when she is. Eleanor called Joseph from the bank parking lot, while Nora sat in the Ford with Wren and read the agreement from the first page to the last in the cold and the fading light. It was everything Cecily had described. It was complete. It had been complete for 3 years, waiting in a box in a bank in a town of 412 people, while Nora taught perspective drawing to middle schoolers and slept in a parking lot and counted money by touch. Joseph arrived the following morning. He drove a truck that had seen considerable mountain weather and wore a fleece jacket and carried himself with the unhurried bearing of someone who had learned that urgency and importance were not the same thing. He was 52, maybe 55, with gray threading through dark hair and eyes that assessed before they offered anything. He shook Nora's hand and held it for a moment, and then said, "Your grandmother was one of the most careful people I've ever worked with. She was also one of the most stubborn." He said it with something that was clearly affection. "She would not let me rush this." He looked at the photographs of the chamber, at the pages Nora had photographed, at Agnes's journal entries about running elk, and he was quiet for a long time. Then one of the elders who had come with him, a man in his 80s hands that carried the texture of a long life eyes, that held something Nora didn't have language for, spoke in quiet and direct, and Joseph translated. "He says he knows that pottery. He says his great-grandmother spoke of it. Objects that were lost, not taken, not destroyed, but hidden by a woman who understood what she was hiding. He says she kept faith when she had no obligation to." He looked at Nora. "He's asking me to tell you that your family's word crossed 5 generations. That's not common. That's worth something." Nora felt the thing she'd been holding in her chest for 8 months shift very slightly towards something that was not quite peace but was moving in that direction. "I have the agreement," she said. "My grandmother signed it. I'm ready to sign it too." Joseph nodded. "Then we file intervention with the court tomorrow morning," he said. "Emergency motion. Federal heritage law gives us standing that your brother's lawyers are going to find very inconvenient." He said this without satisfaction and without regret, simply as fact. "You won't face Monday alone." The courthouse on Monday morning was the same building, different floor, different room, different stakes. Samuel Briggs sat beside Nora in a jacket that had done this before and carried the particular confidence of preparation. Eleanor and Joseph sat in the gallery with 2 tribal elders. Ruth Greer had driven down from Ridgeway at 6 in the morning and was in the 3rd row in a coat she'd apparently saved for occasions, her white hair pinned with unusual precision. She caught Nora's eye when Nora looked back and gave her a single nod that contained in Nora's estimation everything useful that could be communicated. Edmund and Harriet sat with Stanley Richter at the plaintiff's table. Richter in the posture of a man who billed enough per hour to expect things to go his way. Judge Martha Calhoun was in her mid-60s, with the face of someone who had heard every argument twice and was not easily impressed by the ones she'd heard 3 times. She called the room to order with an economy of motion that suggested she valued her time and everyone else's. Richter opened for the plaintiffs with the case he'd built: diminished capacity, undue influence, the irrational distribution of an estate that left one grandchild with essentially nothing, while the others received millions. He mentioned Nora's homelessness 3 times, each time framed as evidence of poor judgment rather than circumstance. He said the words "living in her vehicle with a minor child" with the specific emphasis of a man who understood that shame was a tool. Nora kept her hands flat on the table and let it land without reaction. Sam's response was quieter and took longer, which was its own statement. He walked through the medical records, cognitive testing, showing full function, neurological assessments, showing no impairment, the sworn testimony of 2 physicians, and Frederick Holt, all confirming Cecily's clarity at the time of the will's execution. He introduced the federal intervention motion from the tribal council, which had the immediate effect of making Richter's pen stop moving. Then Sam said, "Your Honor, Mrs. Aldridge left a video testament recorded 2 weeks before her death, specifically addressing the likelihood of this contest." Richter objected. Sam had anticipated every word of the objection and answered each one before Richter finished making it. Judge Calhoun looked at the screen that the bailiff had positioned at the front of the room and said, "We'll view it." The room went quiet in the specific way of rooms waiting for something that matters. And then Cecily was there. She sat at the conference table in Frederick Holt's office, the city visible through the window behind her, dressed in the blue cardigan she always wore when she wanted to feel like herself. She looked at the camera with the directness of someone who had decided at some point in her 89 years that the time for indirection was behind her. "Edmund and Harriet will contest this," she said. "I know them. I've known them their whole lives, and I say this with the particular love of someone who has watched 2 people become exactly who they chose to become. They are successful. They are accomplished. They believe genuinely that success and accomplishment are what I valued most." She paused. "They're not entirely wrong. I am proud of what they built. But pride and trust are different things, and I have learned over 89 years to be careful about which one I'm feeling at any given moment. Nora has failed by every metric Edmund and Harriet would apply. She's divorced. She's in debt. She's been sleeping in her car for 8 months. She said it plainly without flinching. These are the facts." Richter in the gallery made a small sound. Judge Calhoun's expression didn't change. What Cecily said next was quiet enough that the courtroom leaned slightly forward. "And in those 8 months she has not once asked Wren to carry what belongs to adults. She has not let her daughter see her break. She has taught beauty to children who didn't know they needed it and kept teaching it even when she had nothing. She has been offered compromises that would have made her life easier and refused them because they would have required her to become someone she isn't. That's not failure. That's the most difficult kind of character to build because it has to be built without an audience, in parking lots, in gym locker rooms, in the quiet before a 10-year-old wakes up. No one watches that work. No one rewards it. You do it because you understand that who you are when no one is watching is who you actually are. Cecily looked directly into the camera. I left Nora at the mountain because Agnes Whitmore left a promise that has been waiting 5 generations for someone equal to it. I looked at my grandchildren and I chose the one who could carry it, not the richest one, not the most decorated one, the one who kept her word in the dark. She paused once more. Edmund, Harriet, I love you both, but some things I couldn't leave to people who've never had to choose honor over comfort. This was one of them. The video ended. The courtroom held its quiet for a moment that was not empty. Judge Calhoun looked at the plaintiff's table with an expression that had moved beyond judicial neutrality into something more plainly human. Then she looked at her notes and at the federal intervention motion and at the medical records, and she set her pen down. The will contest is denied, she said. The medical evidence is unambiguous. The video testament demonstrates a level of foresight and clarity that is, in fact, the opposite of diminished capacity. She looked at Edmund and Harriet with the precision of someone being careful with words she has chosen deliberately. Your grandmother anticipated this challenge, recorded her reasoning, and addressed it specifically. That is not the behavior of a woman whose judgment was impaired. The custody modification request is denied. There is no evidence of neglect. There is evidence of poverty, which is a different thing, and I'd encourage the petitioners to sit with that distinction. She gathered her papers. Federal heritage protections apply to the Northern Chamber and its contents effective immediately. Will stands as written. All costs and attorney fees are awarded to the defendant. The gavel came down. In the gallery, Ruth Greer exhaled. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Joseph leaned forward and spoke quietly to the elder beside him, who pressed his hands together and held them there. Edmund sat for a moment after Harriet had already begun packing her briefcase. He looked at the screen where Cecily's image had been. He looked at it for a long time, and whatever he was thinking, he kept to himself. And then he stood and walked out without the particular certainty he'd walked in with. He caught up with Nora in the lobby. She almost kept walking. He said her name once quietly, and something in the way he said it made her stop. He looked for the first time in her memory, uncertain. Not defeated, Edmund would recalibrate, reorganize, find a new measure of himself. But uncertain, which was, she thought, the necessary beginning of anything different. I watched that video 4 times last night, he said. She knew exactly what we'd do. She predicted every move. He paused. She was proud of us. She said so. And she still chose you. Nora waited. Not because your salary was bigger, he said. Not because you had a better title. He was working through it in real time. A man applying tools that didn't quite fit the problem. Because of something she saw in you that I apparently don't have yet. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. I don't know what to do with that. You could start by coming to Wren's birthday, Nora said. October 15th. No gift, just show up. He nodded once slowly. I'll be there. He walked to the parking garage, where his car was waiting, and Nora watched him go and thought about what it meant to be changed by something you thought you were going to win. 6 months passed in the particular way that good months pass, not quickly, because they were too full for speed, but without the grinding weight of months spent waiting for something to stop. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in a neighborhood with a school within walking distance and a small park Wren had claimed immediately, spending the first weekend arranging a collection of rocks she'd brought from Ridgeway along the windowsill of her room, each one labeled in her careful handwriting. Not for sale, she told her mother. For keeps. Nora returned to Henderson Middle in September and taught the fall semester to a new group of 6th and 7th graders who were at various stages of caring about perspective drawing. She did not leave the position. She did not apply for other positions. She taught value scales on Tuesdays and contour drawing on Thursdays, and spent Friday afternoons helping students see that the vanishing point was not a place of disappearance, but a place of organization, the point from which everything in the frame could be understood in relation to everything else. The ore samples sold to a private collector and museum in Denver, Harrison Wright, who had spent 40 years chasing specimens of this quality and recognized them for what they were. The collection appraised at $4.5 million. 10% went directly to the Ute Mountain Ute Cultural Preservation Fund. Wright mounted the finest specimens in a dedicated exhibition at the Denver Museum of Natural History. Each piece labeled with the full provenance Agnes Whitmore collection, preserved by Cecily Aldridge, donated by Nora Aldridge. The remaining funds were sufficient for an apartment, a college trust for Wren Conservative Investments that Nora set up with the help of a financial advisor who was the first person in months to look at her accounts without visible alarm, and the restoration of the cabin at Copper Peak, not renovation, but restoration, the particular work of returning something to what it was rather than replacing it with what it could be. The logs kept their silver-gray weathering. The porch was rebuilt from matching timber. The stove was replaced with one that worked, but positioned identically to the original. The northern chamber remained sealed under tribal custody, the key with Joseph running water. The dedication ceremony was in September, when the aspens had turned and the mountain was doing the thing it did in autumn, which was to briefly and without apparent effort become the most beautiful place on earth. 60 people came. Ruth drove down from Ridgeway in a truck that had transported many things and added this occasion to the list without complaint. Eleanor stood near the cabin wall with the expression of a scientist who has seen the hypothesis confirmed and found the confirmation quieter and more satisfying than she'd expected. Samuel Briggs brought his wife and stood at the edge of the gathering with the contentment of a man who had done his job well and required nothing further from the day. Joseph spoke first in Utah and then in English about the difference between owning land and belonging to it. The distinction Agnes had understood and honored, that Cecily had maintained that, was now after 5 generations returned to its proper arrangement. Then Nora stood before the people who had gathered and tried to find words that were equal to what they were standing in the middle of. "I inherited this property homeless," she said, "living in my car. My siblings laughed because they measured what I'd received against what they'd received, and the arithmetic didn't favor me. But the arithmetic was missing variables." She looked at Wren, who was standing in the front sketchbook under her arm, watching her mother with the attentive seriousness she brought to everything that mattered. Agnes Whitmore built this cabin alone in 1871, with no guarantee that anyone would honor what she built it to protect. She built it anyway. She made a promise to a man named Running Elk, not because the promise was convenient, but because she understood that some things are worth more than what they cost. My grandmother kept that promise for 50 years without telling anyone, because the right person to tell hadn't arrived yet. And somehow she paused. Somehow she decided that was me. I don't know if I earned that. I don't know if you can earn something like that in advance. But I know that I intend to be worth it going forward. Edmund was at the back of the gathering, standing slightly apart in clothes that had no performance in them. Not the $3,000 suit, just a jacket, and the look of a man who had come because he'd said he would. Wren had noticed him when he arrived and had gone directly to him and pulled him forward, because that was Wren, who did not believe in leaving people at the margins when there was room at the center. He stood now near the front, hands in his pockets, and when Nora found him in the crowd, he gave her a nod that contained, she thought, the beginning of something he had known how to start before. After the ceremony, as the gathered people drifted into smaller conversations, and Ruth began organizing the food she'd brought without being asked, Nora walked to the cabin. She went inside alone. The interior smelled of new timber and old resin and the particular mineral cold that rose through the floorboards from the chambers below. The afternoon light came through the restored windows at the angle it always came, low and golden, the light of late September in the mountains, the light that makes everything it touches look like something worth preserving. She took the pocket watch from her jacket. It had been with her every day since the law office, in the Ford on the long drives, in the courthouse, in the bank with the safe deposit box, in the classroom on Tuesday mornings when she was teaching value scales and the students were restless and she needed something solid in her pocket to remember what solid felt like. She set it on the window ledge. The case was open. The face caught the afternoon light and threw it back across the cabin floor, a long, warm line of gold, that reached from the ledge to the opposite wall, crossing the floorboards in the same direction the sun had been crossing them for 150 years. The watch ticked, not faster, not slower, the same measured pace it had kept through all of it, through the courtroom and the parking lot and the tunnel and the cavern and the ceremony and the months between. It kept time the way time needed to be kept, without drama, without urgency, with only the steady conviction that the next moment would arrive because the current one was being attended to. Wren appeared in the doorway, her sketchbook open. She'd been drawing the granite cliff face and had come inside to show her mother, but she stopped when she saw the watch on the ledge and the line of light it made across the floor. She looked at it for a long moment. "It's the same light as that first morning," she said, "when I told you the house was talking." Nora looked at her daughter, the same angle, she agreed. Wren came and stood beside her, and they both looked at the line of gold on the old floor. "Do you think Agnes saw this?" Wren asked. This exact light, Nora thought about a woman building alone against a granite cliff in 1871, making a home in a place no one else wanted, discovering something valuable, and choosing over and over to treat the discovery as a responsibility rather than a windfall. "Yes," she said, "I think she saw it every day she lived here." Wren nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd been working on. "Then it's been here the whole time," she said. "We just had to get here to see it." The watch ticked on the ledge. The light crossed the floor. Outside, through the restored window, the aspens on the mountainside were gold against evergreen, and the granite cliff rose behind the cabin as it had always risen, enormous, indifferent, patient, keeping its own time by its own measure, unconcerned with any of the human arrangements that had played out at its feet. Some things don't hurry, some things don't need to. They simply continue marking the hours as they come through every kind of weather, through every kind of hand, until the right person is standing in the right place to finally hear what they've been saying all along. If someone in your life ever handed you something they'd been carrying for a long time, a promise, a truth, a piece of themselves they'd been saving for the right moment, what did it cost them to give it, and what did you do with it?